In the fast-paced rush of Manhattan, where car horns seemed to play the soundtrack of a hurried life, there was a small corner restaurant that barely caught anyone's eye. The sign hung slightly crooked, the walls worn with time, but still, every day, the tables filled with loyal customers. And even though the food was simple and the place far from luxurious, something about it drew people in. A waiter. Tall, sharp-eyed, always with a gentle smile and a kindness that had become rare. His name was Daniel, and if you watched him for more than 5 minutes, you'd notice he wasn't just a waiter. The way he took orders, the delicate way he set the silverware, how he served each dish like it was a piece of art, everything about him radiated grace. But it was a quiet grace. Subtle. Daniel didn't talk about himself or his life outside those walls. "I'm just the waiter," he'd say with a modest smile any time someone asked. But he wasn't. That man carried a past that, if ever revealed, would stop the whole restaurant in its tracks. Still, he never let it show. He preferred the background, the corners, the invisible rhythm that held everything together. Some called him quirky, others said he was just private. But no one guessed that the plain uniform and that little notepad were just the tip of an iceberg, one made of triumphs and also deep scars. There was something in his eyes, a beautiful kind of tired, the kind only people who've carried the weight of the world would understand. Sometimes, at the end of a shift, Daniel would stare at the floor and let out a sigh so deep it felt like it came from another life. "Are you okay?" a customer once dared to ask. He nodded, mumbling, "All good. Just thinking about the pans I burned last night." No one suspected the lie. The truth was, Daniel had lived a lot. And that's no exaggeration. It was the raw reality of someone who once had it all and lost it. But there, in that noisy city, in that little restaurant tucked between skyscrapers, he chose to start over. Far from the spotlight, far from the pain. He didn't want anyone to know who he had been. All he wanted now was to serve well, to hear the laughter coming from the tables, and to quietly go on with his life. That restaurant, for him, was more than a job. It was a refuge, a place to heal, and strangely enough, maybe even a kind of penance. The owners, Mr. and Mrs. Rosenfeld, a middle-aged Jewish couple, treated Daniel with respect. They didn't know much about him, but they trusted him completely. "He's different. There's something in his eyes," Mrs. Rosenfeld would often say. And she was right. There was. Because that man carried a story filled with pain and second chances. And as much as he tried to live as just a simple waiter, there was something in him that couldn't help but shine through. But it wasn't just any talent. It was the kind that, once awakened, changes everything. Even though most people barely noticed him, Daniel did everything with care. From polishing a glass to bringing extra napkins before anyone asked. It was like he found joy in the small things. And that, unintentionally, won people over. Many didn't come back for the food, but for the feeling of being seen and looked after by someone who truly cared. "That waiter's an angel," an elderly woman once said. He heard it, smiled gently, and went back to the kitchen without saying a word. But inside it hurt, because he knew who he really was and how much it cost to hide that every single day. In the rare moments he had to himself, Daniel would pull out an old, worn leather notebook and start writing. Inside, he kept recipes, some with detailed notes, others with nearly indecipherable scribbles. "Can't forget the mushroom sauce timing," he'd whisper softly. That notebook was his treasure. It was as if his true identity lived there, tucked between memories and messy handwriting. It was the only thing he'd brought from Europe. And it was also the last thread connecting him to who he once was, Chef Daniel Lemoyne. He got plenty of invitations to hang out, to talk, to be more social. But he always slipped away with "it got to close out table 3 or need to restock the silverware." The truth? He was scared. Scared of being recognized, of getting attached, of trusting again. Because when everything falls apart, you learn to build walls, not bridges. Still, even surrounded by fear, Daniel never let go of faith. A quiet, personal kind of faith. Not religious, it was deeper than that. Faith in himself, in life, in second chances. Even after everything. Sometimes, when night fell and the restaurant emptied out, He'd turn on the old record player and let Edith Piaf fill the room. And there he would dance alone, between the empty tables, like he was reconnecting with something he'd lost. It was poetic, sad, beautiful. Daniel didn't say much, but his silence spoke volumes. And for those paying attention, it was easy to see. Behind that waiter stood a story of resilience still waiting to be told. A story of daily effort, of a hard life full of secrets, and the persistence of someone who never gave up on himself. Some customers swore they'd seen him before. "Aren't you the chef from TV?" one guy asked once. Daniel just laughed. "I wish. I only know how to fry potatoes." And just like that, he dodged it. But deep down, he knew he couldn't hide forever. One day, the truth would surface, and when it did, no one would be ready. Because the quiet man, serving water with grace, had once served banquets for royalty. And the story that was about to unfold would turn the lives of everyone around him upside down. Daniel knew it. He felt it. His time in the shadows was running out. Something was coming. Something he hadn't planned. But that life, in its sharp irony, had already started writing. And even if he tried to run, fate would find a way to place him right back in the spotlight. But for now, he just set the plates down gently, with a calm smile and a distant look in his eyes, as if saying, "Not yet, but soon, everything will change." Before Manhattan, before the simple uniform and the reserved smile, there was Paris. The City of Light knew the name Daniel Lemoyne well. He was the prodigy of French cuisine, the young man who, at just 28, had earned 3 Michelin stars and kept waitlist full at his restaurant on the Seine. His recipes were studied, his spices became trends, his interviews made headlines. But too much fame also attracts the worst: envy, betrayal, greed. And Daniel, with all his sensitivity, didn't see the poison around him until it was too late. He trusted Louis completely, his business partner and childhood friend. They had dreamed together, worked side by side, grown up in the same poor neighborhood in Marseille. Daniel handled the flavors, Louis the finances. But while one chased excellence, the other plotted in the dark. On a rainy autumn afternoon, a legal notice arrived: fraud, embezzlement, bankruptcy. Daniel tried to make sense of it, but there was no time. The media had already sentenced him. Headlines like "The Chef Who Fooled Paris" popped up everywhere. The scandal was brutal and unfair. In the rare, quiet moments he had to himself, Daniel would pull out an old leather-bound notebook, worn from time and use, and begin to write. Inside were recipes, some carefully detailed, others just scattered scribbles, barely legible. "Can't forget the right texture for the mushroom sauce," he'd whisper softly. That notebook was his treasure. It was as if his true identity lived there, between the ink and the memories. It was the only thing he'd brought from Europe. And it was also the last thread tying him to who he once had been, Chef Daniel Lemoyne. He got plenty of invitations to go out, to chat, to be more social. But he always had an excuse ready. "I need to close out table 3, or I have to restock the silverware." The truth? He was afraid. Afraid of being recognized. Afraid of getting close to someone again. Afraid to trust. Because when everything falls apart, we learn to build walls, not bridges. Still, even surrounded by fear, Daniel never let go of faith. A quiet, private kind of faith. It wasn't religious, it ran deeper. It was faith in himself, in life, in second chances. Even after everything. Sometimes, when the night settled in and the restaurant emptied, he'd turn on the old record player and let Edith Piaf's voice echo through the dining room. And there, under dim lights and between empty tables, he'd dance alone, as if reuniting with everything he had lost. It was poetic, bittersweet, beautiful. Daniel didn't say much, but his silence spoke louder than words. And for anyone paying close attention, it wasn't hard to see. Behind that waiter was a story of survival still untold. A story built on daily effort, on a life full of secrets, on the persistence of a man who never gave up on himself. Some customers were convinced they'd seen him somewhere before. "Aren't you that chef from TV?" one young man asked once. Daniel just laughed. "I wish. I only know how to fry potatoes." And with that, he slipped away once again. But deep down, he knew he wouldn't be able to hide forever. One day, the truth would surface. And when it did, no one would be ready. Because that quiet man who served water with such grace had once served banquets for royalty. And the story about to come to light would flip the world of everyone around him upside down. Daniel knew it. He could feel it. His time in the shadows was running out. Something was about to happen. Something he hadn't planned, but that life, in its cruel, ironic way, was already preparing. And even if he tried to run from it, fate would find a way to place him back in the spotlight. But for now, he just set down each plate gently, wearing that calm smile and distant look in his eyes, as if saying, "It's not time yet, but soon everything will change." Before Manhattan, before the simple uniform and the quiet smile, there was Paris. The city of light knew the name Daniel Lemoyne well. He was the golden boy of French cuisine, the young chef who, by 28, had already earned 3 Michelin stars and packed wait lists at his restaurant on the banks of the Seine. His recipes were studied, his spices became trends, his interviews made headlines. But too much fame often brings out the worst: jealousy, betrayal, greed. And Daniel, with all his sensitivity, didn't see the poison creeping in until it was too late. He trusted Louis with his eyes closed, his business partner and childhood friend. The two had dreamed together, worked side by side, and grown up in the same poor neighborhood of Marseille. Daniel focused on the flavors. Louis handled the finances. But while one pursued excellence, the other plotted in the shadows. On a rainy autumn afternoon, a court summons arrived. Fraud, embezzlement, bankruptcy. Daniel tried to make sense of it, but there was no time. The press had already judged him. Headlines like "The Chef Who Fooled Paris" were everywhere. The scandal was brutal and deeply unfair. He tried to defend himself, tried to prove he was the victim, but no one wanted to listen. The gourmet world, elegant and vain, turned its back on him without hesitation. The restaurant was shut down, the awards stripped from the walls, and his friends? Gone like smoke. "You should have known better," some said. "Be careful who you trust," others warned. But none of them stayed. And in that deafening silence, Daniel truly understood the weight of a fall. From the top, the view is breathtaking. But the crash, it's brutal. The months that followed were the hardest of his life. He slept in shelters, sold utensils he had designed himself, and cooked for community kitchens in exchange for a hot meal. And even then, he didn't give up. "The one thing no one can take from me is my hands," he'd tell himself as he chopped vegetables with a borrowed knife. It was during that time that he discovered a whole other side of life, the one you don't see in glossy magazines, the hard life of the invisible, the forgotten, the ones who work twice as hard and are barely noticed. But even in pain, he never stopped being who he was. Even in anonymity, his dishes had soul. "This sauce reminds me of my grandma's cooking," a homeless woman said one night. And Daniel smiled, because right there, in the ruins, a new kind of faith was born. Not a religious faith, but a deep, quiet belief that he could start over, that his story still had flavor, that his past achievements hadn't been wasted, they were just dormant. And with effort and persistence, he could turn his scars into new recipes. One day, walking down the cold streets of New York, he saw a sign, "Waiter wanted." He didn't think twice. Walked in, filled out the application, and simply said he knew how to serve well. No one picked up on his French accent or the tired sparkle in his eyes. They hired him on the spot. And that's where his second life began. Not as a chef, not as a public figure, but as a waiter in the quiet anonymity of a black uniform and a tray in hand. A conscious choice, a step back that, deep down, was the only way forward. In those first days, he suffered in silence. Nearly bit his tongue when the kitchen cook paired fish with cheese without blinking. "It's just a neighborhood customer, not a food critic," the grill guy shrugged. Daniel swallowed hard, took a deep breath, and served, because at that moment, he needed more to listen than to teach. He had to rebuild from the inside out, relearn how to be small, and that took a kind of strength most people wouldn't understand. But he had it, because persistence, in his case, had started long before the fame. Little by little, the pain turned into longing. and that longing became fuel. He wrote in the leather notebook hidden in his locker, jotted down recipes, memories, ideas, and quietly dreamed of the day he'd cook again, not for recognition, but for love. A love born in childhood, when he watched his mother mix olive oil with lemon to ease sadness. A love that had never left, just gone quiet, and now wanted to speak again. But he would wait for the right time, because he'd learned some recipes take patience. Behind the scenes of the restaurant, Daniel was just another employee. But at night, as he walked through the streets of New York in silence, his heart beat differently. He knew that this exile had a purpose, that what looked like the end was just another chapter, and that life, when you least expect it, can shift course with a simple twist of fate. He didn't know how or when, but he could feel it. One day, the past would come knocking at his door, and when it did, he'd be ready. Until then, he'd serve each dish with the same care a maestro gives an orchestra. Because deep down, even dressed as a waiter, Daniel Lemoyne had never stopped being who he was. He had simply learned to be more than that. He had learned humility, learned to keep the faith even on cloudy days, learned to believe that effort, quiet as it may be, is never wasted, and that true resilience doesn't come all at once, but begins the moment you decide to move forward, even when everything seems lost. And it was on this quiet path of rebuilding that fate began, slowly and silently, preparing his biggest comeback. Daniel had been working at the Rosenfeld's restaurant for months. The place stayed busy, the customers loyal, and the kitchen chaos was just part of the routine. As always, he kept himself. He watched more than he spoke. Silently, he noticed the cook messing up the meat temperature, the sauces lacking soul, the vegetables treated like forgettable extras in dishes that begged for center stage. But even so, he said nothing. He chose silence as a shield. "I'm not here to teach. I'm here to serve," he repeated to himself, a quiet mantra to keep his hands still. Everyone respected him, but no one really saw him. To them, he was just the polite, efficient waiter with a kind smile. Until the night, everything fell apart. It was a Friday, packed house, fully booked, tension in the air. The head chef, Mark, young, impulsive, and inexperienced, called in last minute. Food poisoning had taken him down. Panic swept through the kitchen. Mrs. Rosenfeld was on the verge of tears. "We'll have to cancel everything. This is the end," she whispered. Daniel stood by the door, eyes fixed on a pan forgotten over the flame. Mr. Rosenfeld rushed up to him, desperate. "Daniel, do you know anyone? Any cook, anyone at all?" And then, as if time stood still, Daniel replied with a calm, steady voice, "I've got this." There was no arrogance in his tone, just quiet certainty, like someone who knew exactly what to do. Within seconds, he grabbed the white apron hanging by the hook, washed his hands, and stepped into the kitchen. Everything stopped. The staff looked at each other, confused. "The waiter's going to cook?" someone whispered. But Daniel said nothing. He simply opened the fridge, selected his ingredients, and began slicing with surgical precision. The aroma came first, a smell no one had ever experienced in that kitchen. In minutes, the air was filled with perfectly balanced spices, sizzling sautés, flavors that seemed to dance in the rising steam. Mrs. Rosenfeld covered her mouth, stunned. "My God," she murmured. Plates began to leave the kitchen, one after another, gorgeous, balanced, vibrant. Customers started whispering. Did they change the chef? "This risotto, I've never had anything like it." Phones came out, pictures were taken, videos posted. And there, in that tiny space, a quiet revolution was born. Daniel didn't let emotion take over. He cooked like someone writing poetry, with care, without waste, and full of soul. Mike, the kitchen assistant, stared wide-eyed. "Where did you learn all this?" he asked, watching the sauce turn glossy. Daniel smiled but didn't answer. He simply said, "Watch the rice. If you listen, it'll tell you when it's ready." And Mike listened. For the first time, that kitchen became more than just a workspace. It became a stage. And Daniel, the invisible maestro, conducted everything with quiet brilliance. The hours passed like seconds. Orders kept pouring in. And even though he was exhausted, Daniel never let the quality slip. Every plate was crafted with care. The food wasn't just good, it moved people. It touched them. By the end of the night, the guests stood and applauded. Literally, the entire dining room was on its feet, clapping without even knowing exactly who they were cheering for. Mr. Rosenfeld stood at the kitchen door, eyes filled with tears. You saved our restaurant." Daniel took off the apron, drew a deep breath, and simply replied, "I just did what needed to be done." But everyone there knew they had witnessed something rare. That night, Daniel walked to Central Park. He sat on a bench, staring at the moonlight reflected on the water. And he cried, a quiet cry, mixing pain and relief. Finally, he whispered, because in the middle of the chaos and curious stares, he had found something he thought he'd lost, his essence. And even though he still tried to hide the past, he knew that moment had changed everything. It was only a matter of time before the question started. And he wasn't sure if he was ready. The next day, the restaurant opened early. There was a line forming even before the sign lit up. Local influencers, neighborhood reporters, curious foodies. Everyone wanted to try the magical waiter's cooking. Daniel returned to the dining room, tray in hand, acting like nothing had happened. But the looks were different now. They were filled with admiration. "It was your last night, wasn't it?" some asked. He just smiled, changed the subject, moved on. But inside, the flame that had long been dim was burning bright again. The staff looked at him differently, too. Mike followed him around like a shadow, asking question after question. Mrs. Rosenfeld, moved, handed him a brand-new apron sewn by hand. "For when you're ready to go back into the kitchen," she said softly. Daniel thanked her. He tucked it away, but he didn't put it on. Not yet. Something bigger was building. And he knew whatever was coming couldn't be hidden much longer. The truth was about to be served. And when it arrived, with all the power that true stories of perseverance and effort carry, there'd be no way to hide it. Not behind silverware, not under aprons. The following Saturday, the little corner restaurant that once went unnoticed looked like a completely different place. The sign was still the same, but the buzz on the sidewalk made it clear. Something extraordinary had happened there. The line wrapped around the block. Reporters from local websites and even a food channel from Boston showed up. Customers all wanted to know, who was the chef from that night? Rumors spread like wildfire. It was the waiter, they whispered. He saved everything by himself. Daniel, as always, showed up early, set the cutlery, and pretended not to hear. But his eyes couldn't hide the truth anymore. Mrs. Rosenfeld, usually discreet, couldn't help but show her pride. "Our Daniel is something special," she told journalists, without revealing anything more. But the internet never sleeps. A video of one of the plated dishes went viral. And in the comments, a renowned chef from California wrote, "That plating looks like the work of Daniel Lemoyne." That was all it took. Within 24 hours, the story exploded. The mysterious waiter in New York was actually the long-lost French chef. On foodie forums, blogs, and podcasts, everyone wanted to know, why was he there? What happened? Daniel tried to carry on with his routine, but there was no turning back. Even his co-workers were stunned. "Is it really you?" Mike asked, holding up his phone with an old article. Daniel took a deep breath. He couldn't deny it anymore. At the end of the shift, he gathered the staff, closed the kitchen door, and told them everything. The success, the betrayal, the hard life that followed. And when he finished, the room fell silent. No one mocked him. No one questioned him. Mr. Rosenfeld stepped forward, placed a hand on his shoulder, and said, "You've always been our chef. We just didn't know it yet." The revelation triggered a wave of consequences. Press agents called. Magazines wanted interviews. Old colleagues tried to reconnect. But Daniel hesitated. He wasn't sure if he wanted that world back. The wound still hurt. The abandonment, the humiliation, the feeling that all his effort had been thrown away, it was hard to forget. And yet, something inside him stirred again, a desire to prove that his achievements weren't just a memory, that there was still more to create, that maybe this was his real comeback, one with meaning. In the dining room, the guests remained enchanted. But now, their eyes sparkled differently. "It's him," they whispered, trying not to stare. Kids asked for pictures. Young culinary students came with questions. And Daniel, even though he disliked fame, listen closely. Cooking is like loving, he told one young woman. It takes time, care, and the courage to mess up. He knew his story was inspiring others, and that gave purpose to the pain he had endured. His persistence had finally found a voice. The media wasn't letting go. Headlines like The Return of a Master and Daniel Lemoyne, From Silence to Spotlight, flooded food blogs and culinary websites. But the message that moved him most was a handwritten note left at the restaurant's door. "Thank you for proving it's possible to start over with dignity." That stayed with him for days. Because that was it. At the core, he didn't crave fame. He wanted respect. He wanted to be seen as someone who overcame, who chose to fight even when everything seemed lost. And the buzz didn't stop. A cooking channel invited him for a special competition. A luxury hotel in Chicago offered its kitchen for a month. But he turned them all down. Not out of arrogance, out of wisdom. It's not time yet, he told himself each time he folded the invitations and slipped them into his jacket pocket. There was something about the Rosenfeld's small restaurant that gave him peace. And he knew it was on that humble floor that this new chapter of his life would take root. The nights began to taste different. With each dish he served, Daniel felt the past slowly making peace with the present. It was as if every recipe stitched a piece of him back together. And the guests came not just for the flavor, but for the story, for the faith of someone who chose to believe again, for the persistence of someone who fell, but stood up stronger. He was no longer the invisible waiter, not just the European prodigy. He had become something greater, living proof that healing can be more satisfying than any Michelin star. But fate, always seasoned with irony, still had one last surprise. An unexpected invitation from someone in the past. A chance to face his ghosts and perhaps prove, one final time, that even when everything is taken from you, you can still rise with grace. The news spread fast. Daniel Lemoyne, the chef who reappeared as a waiter in Manhattan, had turned down million-dollar offers to keep cooking in a small neighborhood restaurant. The decision shocked the culinary world. Has he lost his mind, some asked. But those who had looked into his eyes knew there was no madness there, only peace, a choice. Because after everything, he wasn't chasing fame, he was chasing purpose. And that's exactly what he had found among those narrow tables, under the warm lights, in the scent of garlic sizzling in olive oil, the true flavor of his own story. Every day, letters arrived. Some were thank you notes. Others came from young people who dreamed of becoming like him. "You gave me the courage to follow my dream," read one message, written in shaky handwriting. Daniel read each word as if it were a rare spice. Because deep down, that's what he wanted, to inspire, to show that the most beautiful achievements are born from resilience. That a hard life doesn't define who we are, but how strong we've become. And that persistence, when seasoned with faith, becomes strength. Little by little, he fully took over the kitchen. The former head chef was transferred to another restaurant in the group, and Daniel, with his gentle firmness, began training the staff. "Here, we cook with honesty," he'd say, while teaching Mike how to cut onions into perfect julienne strips. It wasn't about impressing, it was about feeling, about reaching someone through a warm plate like offering an open hand. And in that new environment, something magical happened. A kitchen where no one shouted, but everyone learned. Where every dish told a story. Where every bite was a quiet victory. The Rosenfelds renovated the restaurant. Without changing its soul, they added more tables, new plates, softer lighting. But the heart remained the same. And Daniel, his name now, sat at the top of the menu. Yet no one treated him like a celebrity. He was just Daniel, the man who danced to Nina Simone while stirring sauces, who smiled at children and served his own food, even as the chef. And that was what truly moved people. Because it was real, because it was human, because it came from someone who had already tasted the bitterness of falling. One day, a group of critics came in unannounced. They tasted the dishes, took photos, scribbled in notebooks, and left in silence. The following week, a headline appeared. The chef who turned down luxury and turned a humble restaurant into the new temple of soulful cuisine. Daniel read it, sighed, and tucked the clipping between the pages of his old leather notebook. The same one that had followed him since Paris. "This is what success tastes like," he whispered. "Flavor, soul, and truth." It wasn't about a grand comeback. It was about staying with purpose. Over time, the restaurant became a local landmark. People from all over the country came to taste the food of the chef who had overcome shame, abandonment, and pain. He, however, stayed the same. He cooked with humility, taught with patience, and smiled with gratitude. Life hadn't gone easy on him, but he held no resentment. On the contrary, every hardship he faced seemed to have been an essential ingredient in the most important dish of his life: peace of mind. And then something changed. One customer, a television producer, suggested turning his story into a series. "People need to hear what you've lived through." Daniel laughed, but this time he didn't say no. "Maybe," he said, because now, more than ever, he understood that stories of resilience deserve to be shared. That silent effort deserves a voice, and that a hard life can, indeed, become a source of inspiration. Not to be glamorized, but to remind us all that inside each of us lives a unique seasoning: faith. And it was exactly that faith that had carried him this far. Through the cold nights, the lonely days, the unfair judgment. It stayed with him when no one else did. And now, it was leading him into a new chapter. A chapter without fear, without masks, where he could be everything: chef, waiter, mentor, friend, but above all, human. On the last page of his notebook, Daniel wrote, "Conquering the world is tempting, but conquering yourself, that lasts forever." And so, between laughter, pots and pans, and shared stories, he kept going. Steady steps, light soul, because he had learned that the greatest prize wasn't a star in a guidebook, but the light in the eyes of someone who feels truly nourished, inside and out. And that's how, without promising anything to anyone, Daniel Lemoyne achieved something very few ever do: genuine admiration. The kind you can't buy, the kind you can't measure, the kind that comes from the heart of someone who, even after the fall, chose to keep serving with love. Like this video if you believe true talent never fades. Comment below. Have you ever been underestimated because of your appearance or your job? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more powerful stories like this. Share this video with someone who could use a little inspiration today.